Merhabalar, hepiniz tekrardan hoş geldiniz. Sona yaklaştığımız bu
Hello
günlerde
to everyone. We are about to over our program, but we should still remind you that this program would be recorded and broadcasted via YouTube. And this program is supported by Support Program for Human Rights. And I would like to give the floor to Mr. Feyzi Baba. Yes, as we are about to complete our program, I already said that we were accustomed to each other and have such an organization on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So once it's over, we will feel weird. Immediately after that, we should organize something else, I think, because we provide a great harmony with the group, and those seminars make much sense and they are really very effective. And you know that Carlo kept us informed about Latin America last week, especially Mexico-US border and associated migration crisis were addressed by her in detail. That was such kind of a lecture. And now we will proceed with Latin America theme again. And why are we doing that? Because Kemal Tarlan, the director of Kırkayak, said that Latin America issue is not something which Turkish people are familiar with, since though the migration issue is a really very important one in Latin America, but it is not so much known in Turkey. We are not so much familiar with it. That's why we intended to invite two very important experts, and we would like to include Latin America in our general framework. And today, Masaya Llavaneras-Blanco would be together with us, and we will be talking about Venezuela crisis with her. But beforehand, I would like to introduce her. I have been familiar with her for several years, and Masaya Llavaneras-Blanco is now a lecturer in Western Ontario University, and she deals with development researches. She's a lecturer there, and also for a new age, women-oriented new development alternatives for Southern Hemisphere. She is one of the feminist activists. She is indeed an executive board member of that network of feminists. And also, she deals with women's studies, critical migration studies, and border research. And also, for the time being, the mobility of Venezuelans in Caribbean region and Latin America are also addressed by her. And we can say that Dominican Republic research is one of her research areas. The Haitians and mobility problem of Haitians who are nationals of Dominican Republic, there is such a research conducted by her. And global social policy, environmental policy journals are among those where she published her articles, and also she is co-author of some books, and she is also a lecturer in that university, as I said, but she is a Venezuelan, and she is a new settler in Canada, so to say, and we can also highlight that she has a deep knowledge about Latin America, and it is our luck to be together with her today here. And I would like to thank her once again for her time with us, allocating time to us and sharing information with us. And I would like to give the floor to her without taking much of your time.
Okay, good afternoon to you in Turkey, and morning to you, Dr. Baban.
Yes, it's still morning.
Yes. I wanted to thank Dr. Rigel and Dr. Baban for inviting me, and for Kir Kayak for hosting this space. It's a luxury for me to get in touch with thinkers and activists and researchers in Turkey, to share some of my work. A little note to say that, in fact, I know Dr. Baban for a few years, he says. I say maybe 20, when he was my undergraduate professor. So it's really an honor for me to share space with him now, also being a professor myself. I also wanted to appreciate the fact that we have interpreters that allow us to communicate across cultures. I am, as Dr. Baban said, I am a feminist activist, and a lot of my work is with the Global South and from the Global South. The work of interpreters is a treasure for making that sort of dialogue possible. So in every occasion, I want to appreciate their work and their presence. Today, I will be sharing with you some of my work with and about Venezuelan mobilities in South America in particular. This is incipient work that I've been carrying out first rather informally as a Venezuelan person abroad, and as a migration scholar, and I've been slowly kind of adding more of my attention to it as time passes and the crisis worsens. So that it's incipient work, and I will get to it with the presentation. I was thinking that I will use my time presenting some of my analysis with you, and then having the rest of the time to discuss questions, comments, and also perhaps include part of the conversation about the gender implications of these mobilities, which I will not address in the presentation for the sake of clarity. I thought it was rather important to first think and introduce the crisis and the context first. So I will share my screen now. Hopefully you will see it. I'm always a little insecure with what can be seen from other screens. Thank you, Denise. So here's the title of the presentation for today's Venezuelan Spectacles, Reflections about Venezuelan Mobilities in South America. And I use the term spectacles in a way that hopefully will become clear as I proceed. This picture I'm using to begin with is from Corredores Migratorios, which is a civil society endeavor that involved a lot of journalists from South America that began acting in solidarity with people on the move, covering their stories and their trajectories as Venezuelans and also people from elsewhere became visible in cities and in rural areas in South America as a whole. It's important to say that Venezuelans became very visible, and that they're the largest population on the move in the region. But before that, South America has been as a hub of mobilities that has globalized. There are Haitians, Nigerians, Bangladeshis, people from really everywhere moving through South America, often on their way to North America, at least in principle, and then people stay in different places. So as I was thinking about the presentation I would share with you all, I structured it like this. First, the first 2 points introducing the context. So thinking about a growing and a relatively new transnational population of Venezuelans in the region. The political and economic, and I should say social crisis that propels this large-scale mobility. And then I would move on into the caminantes, which is the Spanish word for walkers, as many Venezuelans have been referred to, is the key word for Venezuelans on the move, a particular side of Venezuelans, I should say, those that move walking or hitchhiking. And then I will go into the aspect of the spectacle that I used in my title. I will talk about spectacle and negation, about spectacle returns, thinking about how returns have been part of the mobilities in the Venezuelan-Colombian borderlands in particular, seeing the border from outside, and closing with some reflections about invisibility and a spectacle and the liminality in which Venezuelans find themselves as they move in South America. First, think about the acute increase of Venezuelans on the move in the past 6 years. Venezuela had a long history of thinking of itself as a receiving country, not as a sending country. In the late 1940s and 50s, Venezuela prided itself in having received many people from the post-war period, especially Spaniards and Italians and Portuguese. Also, and it should be said, as part of a racist project on the last dictators of the 20th century, who thought of this as an opportunity to whiten the population. But apart from that, Venezuela also received many Dominicans escaping the ruthless dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo, Argentinians, Uruguayans, Chileans escaping the dictatorships of the Southern Cone in the 1970s. And a lot of these presence lasted for decades. In fact, there is a large kind of diasporic population of Venezuelan Europeans and Venezuelan Argentinians, etc. However, as the political and economic crisis began to pick up in the 2000s, especially after 2010 and 2015 and onwards, Venezuelans started to be more of a net exporter, as they say in conventional migration literature, with more people living than coming into the country. And as of 2017 and after, the increase of Venezuelans on the move and abroad became significant. Today, the UNHCR speaks about 5.2 Venezuelans outside of Venezuela who left in the last 6 years. Most of them are in South America. And here I'm showing you a graph by Francisco Rodriguez, who is a Venezuelan scholar, who's also counting those of us who left the country before 2015. In my case, for example, I left in 2012. I thought it was important to locate Venezuela. Venezuela is in the north of South America. We also love to think of ourselves as Caribbean people. So we're the lucky South Americans who are also Caribbeans. And I think it's also important to see the map in order to think about where people are going. It becomes clear to see why people move to Colombia, for example, as the major recipient country. There are 1.7 Venezuelans living there. About 55% of them live without migrant status. Another majority is in Peru, and this is related, among other things, to the visa regime that Peru had for a couple of years, who was perceived as rather welcoming. Chile is also an important recipient, and Argentina, Peru, Brazil, and Ecuador. It's also interesting in Ecuador, the Venezuelan population is rather noticeable, not so much because of the quantity of Venezuelans compared to, as many as there are in Colombia and Peru, but because of the small population in Ecuador and how noticeable the newcomers are. So why are Venezuelans leaving? Venezuela has been undergoing one of the deepest economic crises in the world right now. Is one of the largest economic contractions outside conflict zone. Our GDP decreased by 80% between 2013 and 2020, which means our economy today is 20% of what it was in 2013. So it's a rather drastic deterioration of the economy. This is related to a complex set of factors, which I won't delve into. One of them is the drop in oil prices in the 2012 onwards. I said over a decade-long currency control that became anachronic. It is not over a decade, it's almost 2 decades long currency control that became anachronic, and a booming informal market of foreign currency, which today is reflected into the dollarization of our economy. The oil industry's difficulty acquiring loans and the decrease of production to the point that Venezuela, being a net exporter of oil, is currently an importer. We're using imported diesel and gas, and we live in hyperinflation. Adding insult to injury, the US imposed sanctions, especially from 2017 and 2019, the worst of them being the 2019 ones, where the US stopped buying Venezuelan oil, despite, the kind of the narrative of the socialist narrative of the country. Venezuela depended on US oil purchases, which kind of increased the heat of the weight of the sanctions up until today. This has had a significant impact in terms of poverty measures. Measuring poverty by the poverty line, over 96% of Venezuelans live in poverty today. If we measure these with multidimensional poverty measures, we can think about 65% of multidimensional poverty. And again, if you remember the earlier draft of our increased mobilities. It has a similar shape when we see the increase in poverty in the country, which picks up slowly in 2013, but goes up very fast after 2015. This has clear implications in terms of quality of living. I think one of the most dramatic aspects of the Venezuelan context is not only the actual social indicators, but the way they have increased so sharply in very short time. So the country became unrecognizable very soon to what we were used to. So Venezuela has been, and civil society speaks of Venezuela living in a complex humanitarian crisis as of 2017, with the collapse of public health systems, the increase of maternal mortality and child mortality as perhaps one of the clearest signs of the decline in the conditions of living. Today, as a reference, 2 days ago when I updated this, and sounds silly, but in a context of hyperinflation, these things change very quickly. As of Sunday, the Venezuelan minimum wage was $3 a month, which gives you an idea of the dramatic context. This is often complemented with some non-cash transfers, like food boxes that are unreliable and politicized in many ways. So along this, we have had sustained political crisis, especially since 2014, and growing extrajudicial killings classified as resistance to authority. So there are many gaps in terms of statistics of any kind in Venezuela, but according to official figures, people who resisted authority and were killed by Venezuelan police forces amounted to over 5,000 people in 2018. A number that decreased drastically in 2019 and remained quite high internationally. The context of political persecution, the criminalization of protests, and also declining democracy with an electoral system that hasn't been reliable since 2015. So this is very briefly a little bit of the context that has made people live. In a qualitative research from 2018, where people were asked at the border why they were leaving, the most important aspect for people were the conditions of living. Over 50% referred to lack of access to food, which in 2017 was severe. That has picked up, although has been dollarized currently. Lack of access to medicine and treatments, and also lack of work. Venezuela today has the lowest economic activity of all of Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's the context, and that's what produced what has been called the caminantes, which is the increased number of people who left, especially from 2017 onwards. People left walking. Historically, Venezuelans can cross the Colombian border with their national ID. So that made it easy. And this is an important aspect because Venezuelans had a very poor access to travel documents and passports for the past 5 years, with delays of up to 2 years or longer to actually obtain a passport. So often people left without documents because they had no option. And living through Colombia was not only feasible because it's a fairly urbanized border crossing, but also easier in principle due to our ability to cross with cédulas, which are the national IDs. That has not been as easy with time, especially because Venezuelan and Colombian authorities have a long history of playing with the border. They open it and close it for political reasons. So Venezuelans are often living through informal crossings, like the picture on the left. Those informal crossings have been booming. And they have been also heavily criminalized by informal armed groups. It's important, and you must have seen it in the crisis group document that was shared, to think that Colombia comes from over 50 years of civil conflict. The Venezuelan-Colombian borderlands have a long history of being part of that conflict period, which has continued, especially due to the fragilization of the Colombian peace process. So not only are people crossing informally and in unsafe circumstances, but also through places that have been and continue to be controlled by informal armed groups, both paramilitary and guerrilla groups on both sides of the border. What has been interesting, or rather what has been noticeable in the crisis, though, is that people walking not only were seen walking through the border, but people started to walk into the cities, often walking over 200 kilometers or more through rather treacherous paths. So in a way, the Venezuelan crisis became noticeable through its own caminantes, through its, I would say, migrants, but and this is a large discussion about how to call them. In fact, the UNHCR created this particular category where they talk about migrants, refugees, and displaced Venezuelans, as if, you know, there was a particular category for us. So in the midst of this crisis, the idea and the image of Venezuelans moving has become heavily politicized. And for a long time, Venezuelan authorities said that there were no Venezuelans abroad, or that the number of Venezuelans were abroad was insignificant. This was, you know, attributed to political manipulation from governments that were against the Maduro government. In fact, as recently as January this year, President Maduro spoke about only 600 Venezuelans abroad, and according to him, 300,000 have returned, which is a very, very, very far estimate compared to the UNHCR estimate of 5.2 million. So for a long time, there was this idea that Venezuelans abroad were rich people who could, you know, afford a life of luxury in the first world, and caminantes, and the presence of the caminantes kind of began to challenge that notion to the point that the government has had to talk about this, even if reducing numbers so comically in this context. However, not only is the Venezuelan government kind of playing with the negation or playing politically, in this case, with the negation of the dimensions of the issue, but the rest of the governments in the region. There is a big question, for example, about who is responsible for Venezuelans abroad, especially if people are forced to leave through informal border crossings. Often Venezuelans are not registered in any way. They're just walking through these informal crossings without any documentation. So the informalization and the irregularization of the presence has become the norm for about, you could say about, at least in Colombia, 55% of them. And there is this constant discussion about who is responsible for them. And in the context of COVID, this became rather grotesque, with discussions about who is entitled to treatment, who is entitled to vaccines. And President Duque in Colombia, who is himself in fire right now for the levels of political violence against demonstrations ongoing in Colombia at the moment, today. He was quoted in December last year saying that no Venezuelan without documents would have access to the vaccine, and that it was Maduro's responsibility to vaccinate his own people. This is in the case of Colombia, but that tone and that discussion continues to be part of the regional response at the level of governments, and most regional meetings and these conventions around the issue of Venezuelans abroad are focused on the issue of resources. How are we going to fund this crisis? But there is little in terms of regional coordination, for example, in terms of regularization of their presence. And this, of course, is related to the ghost of the Cold War. Venezuela being the last Latin American version of socialism of the 21st century government standing, and the booming of right-wing governments in South America at the moment. A perfect example of this was the recent Ecuadorian elections, where Venezuelan migrants in the streets of Guayaquil, one of the main cities in Ecuador, were hired to have big signs during the last day of the elections, telling people that they were in this situation because of voting socialism, right? So this idea of making the Venezuelan political experiment that went rather badly, if you ask me, blaming this on socialism in ideological terms, and using Venezuelan migrants living on the streets or in very poor conditions as the spooky example of why not to vote to socialist or leftist governments. This is perhaps one of the most vulgar uses of creations of spectacles around them in the region. And then back in Venezuela, when finally the government decides to speak about Venezuelans abroad, this is done first kind of using a lot of quotation marks, speaking of the so-called exodus, speaking about those shelters receiving Venezuelans abroad as shelters paid by Miami, rich Venezuelans in Miami who are from the extreme right, and this politicization of Venezuelan migrants, especially poor migrants and people who are living in conditions of precarity, as kind of infantile subjects that were that fell into the trap of Miami-based elites that are benefiting from their misery. And this infantilization became quite clear in one of Maduro's speeches from 2018, and he compared the situation of Venezuelans abroad with those of people who leave their family. And here I'm quoting him. He says, "In times of hardship, one does not abandon their family. One does not abandon the homeland." So this idea that those who decided to leave during the crisis were, you know, bad relatives. They were ungrateful. They did not stay during the hard times, and kind of attributing their misery to their lack of commitment to work for the country. This plays out also in the narrative about returns. Venezuela has and the Colombian borderlands has a long history of returns. As I said earlier, Colombia comes from decades of civil war, which meant that many Colombian refugees lived in Venezuela, especially in the borderlands. And they were about the first to leave when the crisis became worse. Not only these refugees, but also Colombo-Venezuelan families, which are quite a common mix due to the proximity and the cultural proximity, not only territorial proximity. And the idea of the return was often used also from the Venezuelan government through, for example, the spectacular deportation of Colombian Venezuelans in the borderland in 2015, when the government attributed part of the scarcity and economic crisis of the region to Colombo Venezuelans smuggling goods that were meant to be for Venezuelans back into Colombia. And there were quite I would say spectacular, for lack of a better word, but quite, you know, noticeable strategies of pointing out who those people were. And here, this picture shows you how there is a D, and these are poor people. If you see the housing where they're living, this is where deportees lived. These were their homes before they became deportees. And the government authorities would come and spray their houses with a D, pointing at their deportation. These returns were from Venezuela to Colombia in 2015, and later in 2017 and 2018, the returns change direction and start to take place from South America into Venezuela. And this begins the idea of the return, and this is how the government presents it. In 2018, in Peru, when Maduro is part of a People's Summit, and he receives a letter from a family at the Venezuelan consulate in Peru asking for a safe way back, and kind of magnanimously he comes up with this policy of return to the homeland, and it's presented as again, this idea of, well, these people made the mistake of leaving. The ungrateful child is back, and they're, happy and relieved to be coming back. And it's also part of a diplomatic move, of course, again, in a very complex geopolitical situation in South America. The idea of the retorno a la patria, the return to the homeland, is a diplomatic move. And here is Vice Minister of Communication describing it as a way in which the Bolivarian diplomacy is, I would translate that into kind of, it's imposing itself in the world. This idea that the return to homeland was in itself part of that foreign policy. As of today, there are many problems with the numbers, in accessing numbers in Venezuela. There is no access to social, economic, or any sort of statistics since 2017. So it's really hard to come by official figure. Trying to follow up with government announcements to the media, one can think about over 100, between 100 and 200,000 people who have returned through this voluntary return program, which is, well, heavily present in national media. And lastly, there is another series of returns some of which have still taken place through the return to homeland policy, but also took place more informally. And this is due to the dramatic situation of Venezuelans outside of Venezuela. Recently, I shared a seminar with an Ecuadorian academic who was talking about the tragedy of how Venezuelans in Venezuela and Venezuelans outside of Venezuela are becoming increasingly poor either way. About 130,000 people came back in the context of COVID, especially in the onset of the pandemic. Between March and August is when most people came back. And this is related, among other things, to the socioeconomic consequences of the quarantine and the social isolation periods, when people were not allowed to roam the streets, in a context in which most migrants depended, or most Venezuelans in Colombia and Ecuador and Peru in particular, depended on informal work, which is often, selling sweets on the streets, selling items of different kinds, begging, also doing a lot of delivery service. A lot of these became impossible in the context of the pandemic, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, when these norms were taken very seriously. They were also criminalized. And one of the most tragic aspects of the pandemic for them was that a lot of the shelters in Colombia in particular were closed because they were unable to keep the biosafety conditions to host. And also, one could say a certain purposeful neglect on the side of Colombian authorities, who kind of, one could say, were overwhelmed by the crisis but also did not make it hard for people to need to leave. It was, in fact, often some local governments would provide buses for Venezuelans to get back to the border in their non-deportation friendly expulsion in the context of the pandemic. And there was also this fantasy of returning home among many migrants in a context of despair and in confronting also the challenges that come along with mobilities that are irregularized and that were exacerbated in the context of the pandemic. And this confronted people with the border from outside, which is something that one doesn't think of often, especially I don't think Venezuelans had a kind of a history of that confrontation. In the context of the pandemic, the border has been closed for over a year. And before that, the border was closed on and off repeatedly. Due to the biosafety complexities of the border, this became more difficult. And this is the border between Venezuela and Colombia and Brazil here. You can see it's a very large border. During the pandemic, only two, especially during the first, let's say the 2020 period of the pandemic, only two official border crossings were open. And they were taking only between 310 and 100 people per day, three times per week, which very quickly became a problem because most people were stalling the border side on the Colombian side without any form of shelter in a context of the pandemic, which became increasingly dramatic. After the crisis unfolded, UNHCR came up with some sort of shelter during this period. And once this this process began to develop, people became tired of waiting and started using the informal border crossings, which became a significant concern. The official process involved, once you managed to get through the border, there were 71 passes, which were, sorry, I just left this in Spanish here. I just realized places of social integral care, we would say, which were basically shelters for people coming back. And the return home became, well, even more complex through those passes, as I will say in a minute. Before that, though, it's important to remember or to contextualize the conditions under which people were coming back. People that returned home by land were often people who were in desperate situations. So the few testimonials that I have been able to gather through humanitarian workers at the border are mostly people who left with whatever food they could get from their pantry, which wasn't much, and just walked with the food they had at hand. So there was, not a lot of, there were no savings, not a lot of food. The conditions of these journeys were quite dramatic. Once people arrived to the border, they would spend about a week waiting to get through. Once they were able to get through, they would spend 14 days in these shelters. If they were tested negative for COVID, they would spend officially 14 days in another shelter. But these periods extended to 3 months or however long, because people had no money even to take buses to their regions of residence and then reach their place of origin. So in some accounts, people took about 4 months to actually get home after they crossed the border. And there were many issues of concern related to the conditions of living within the shelters, which were rather unequal. In some cases, they were safe enough. In most cases, these were schools that were adapted into shelters. But in others, there were significant concerns in terms of access to water and food. And most, I think, concerning is that most of these shelters were militarized. They were handled by the National Guard, which created many concerns in terms of people's human rights in general. So there is very little information about the conditions of these official returns, but even less information about returns that became irregularized. If people decided to not wait to get through, they would often go through irregular crossings, which became a scandal in government media, with government officials referring to returnees as biological weapons. And in some cases, they were described as being sent by the Colombian government as a literal biological weapon to bring the virus into the country. And this increased again the stigma around the returnees, not only because of the pandemic, but also this idea, this weaponization of the pandemic and the bodies of the returnees themselves. And that, alongside the notion of the failed migratory project, when people left assuming they would improve their conditions of living, and they returned empty-handed, and their conditions of life often worsened. Another key aspect about these returns and about the border in general is the existence of pendular populations of people who have lived in the borderlands historically. And these are populations that for decades have, used the market on a side, the schools on the other. And that became increasingly important during the socioeconomic crisis in Venezuela, when a lot of food was found in Colombia, so people needed to cross the border. So when people are crossing irregularly, it's not only migrants that have taken long journeys, but pendular populations that depend on these mobilities regularly. And are exposed to the securitization of these region, increasingly also in the context of the pandemic and the growing informal conflict between irregular groups in the area. I'm not sure if this news reached Turkey, but last month there was a big confrontation between Venezuelan and Colombian armies, with as well guerrillas and paramilitaries in this region, which produced a new group of displaced people from this side of the border to here. And those armed encounters seem to be increasing in a concerning manner. which again is intensified by the lack of communication between the two governments, which are kind of on the opposite spectrum of the ideological divide in South America today. So in my analysis, which again is incipient of the situation of Venezuelans abroad and Venezuelans on the move in particular, I see a tension between invisibility and spectacle. There's the lack of official figures, kind of the negation of their existence on a side, or the stigma of the ungrateful child on the other. And here is a quote from President Maduro last year, talking, he's literally saying, well, if Brazil and Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, and Peru, if they were so cool, why are Venezuelans coming back? Why did they not stay there? So this idea of kind of, I told you so, you shouldn't have left, narrative is quite clear and continues to be clear in the current context. The stigma of the pandemic, which I think is generalized, this idea of the migrant as the carrier of the virus, is something that has been present not only among Venezuelans, but it's clearly among them because of the amount of us, which noticeable in the region. And the stigma of the failed migrant journey, this idea, you know, that people left with versus what they found. These different complexities makes me think of the fragility of citizenship and belonging, and how not only this is a problem of how the region sees, and especially the political elite, because to be fair, there are many signs of solidarity on the grassroots, especially for caminantes in Ecuador and Colombia. But the governments have been using this idea of the Venezuelans on the move quite extensively, not only non-Venezuelan governments, but also the Venezuelan government itself, trying to create a narrative that is often not about the migrants, but rather an kind of infantilization of them, speaking of them as a cautionary tale of whoever's political agenda is being narrated. And before I leave the presentation and open the conversation that I'm hoping we will have, I'm convinced about the idea or the power of speaking about the complex, very complex situation in Venezuela from the lens of people moving and people abroad and people, refugees and migrants. And I'm very hesitant to use any particular category because I think it's a diverse group, also those of us who left the country. But certainly I think mobilities present a needed epistemological entry point, another way to enter into the Venezuelan context. And I'm interested in finding ways to speak from the situation of those on the move, rather than on the based on the narratives from the political elites that have, you know, instrumentalized their situation ad nauseum and continue to do so. And I find myself going back to read Edward Said and thinking about Orientalism, because it has become clear to me that the describing and the speaking of Venezuela and Venezuelan migrants is often done in an Orientalist fashion in which the narrative of what these mobilities mean and what these mobilities entail is imposed on the notions of the socialist project or on the notions of capitalism, for example, on the Venezuelan side. So here's a quote from the introduction to Orientalism from Said, where he asks, how then to recognize individuality and to reconcile it with its intelligent and by no means passive or merely dictatorial general and hegemonic context. So this need to think about the particular experiences of those living without, being blind to the general context and the geopolitical context of the Venezuelan crisis is, of course, a big challenge that I think it's probably the richest way to tackle it. And with that, I'll leave you for now, and I hope to hear your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Masaya. It's wonderful and very informative lecture. Lots of information, for us to absorb and process. And I think your presentation actually was quite important, because in last session, in Carla's presentation, we sort of understood the dynamic between Mexico-US border, the movement towards north, and in yours, through the Venezuelan case, you actually told us the dynamics within the Latin American context, intermingled with nationalism and tensions between states. So in that sense, I think it just came very nicely together. If there are any questions, anybody have any questions? Eğer sorular varsa. Vural Fatma'nın bir sorusu var. Go ahead, Fatma.
Tamam, teşekkürler. Gracias Masaya.
Thank you very much. That context in Venezuela, that process is clearly explained by you. Thank you very much. During 1940s and 50s, it is a welcoming country. Indeed, in 1970s, again, it is a welcoming country from Argentina, Chile, and from different countries. So what kind of an experience attained during that period when Venezuela was a welcoming country, receiving country? I would like to learn about it. And right after that, there are economic transformation and crisis. But I would like to hear about the period and experiences which are associated with the period when or during which Venezuela is a receiving country, welcoming country.
Should I go ahead now or okay?
Yes, please, please.
Okay, thank you, Fatma, for your question. Venezuela, for a long time, was among the richest countries in South America, and that's why it was also quite an attractive destination for people on the move. A lot of Europeans that came to Venezuela in the 50s, 40s and 50s were the same group of Europeans that went to Argentina, Uruguay. So it was one of those booming economies at the time that was perceived as also a very modern country in South America. And this is related to the wealth of oil and oil exploitation in the country. This was also probably one of the main magnets in the 70s when Venezuela received what amounted to 3 plan Marshalls in oil revenues. So there was a lot of money to go around. Venezuela has a sort of mythology of itself as a very welcoming country, which in some way it was. But it was also a country that did not have a migration policy to be not a rational one, not a particular migration policy to be talked about. And there was a lot of tension around the irregularization of certain groups, particularly Haitians and Colombians, had a very difficult time during the 80s and 90s in Venezuela. Perhaps not at the scale that Venezuelans are encountering now, but I remember growing up, for example, during my childhood and my adolescence, I was taught to always leave the house with my Venezuelan ID because I could be ID'd anywhere. And the urban legend is that if you were caught without your national ID, you would be deported right away. So I think our history as a receiving country is less romantic than a lot of people like to think of. But we did have a history of reception. And it's interesting, for example, a lot of my research has been in the Dominican Republic. And I received 2 first reactions from people when they learned about me being Venezuelans. And the first reaction of people was quite warm because Venezuela had been a place where a lot of their relatives had been to and had been well received. And also Venezuela supported an attempt of democratization or the democratization process of the Dominican Republic between the 70s and the 90s. So there was that side of it that is part of how we are perceived abroad, but is not without problems.
Thank you, Masaya. And I see Abir. Abir has a question. Go ahead, Abir. Sorabilirsin sorunu Abir. Pardon.
Merhaba, teşekkürler. Sesimi alıyorsunuz.
Hello, could you hear me?
Evet, merhabalar. Çok teşekkür ediyorum ben de bu.
Thank you very much for this fruitful presentation. I am a Syrian and I am interested in the approach of Maduro. And once you make mention of his approach, I could also see how his approach is similar with ours, because our regime claimed that those migrants are traitors, they left their countries, their homelands, because they are supported by external countries, outsiders. So they are unfaithful sons and daughters. And also, we witnessed a huge polarization in between different groups of Syrian community. That polarization has been ongoing now. And if a person belongs to a political group, a certain political group, then he or she cannot come together with members of other political groups. Some migrants could not go to some certain territories or geographies because those geographies are dominated by those who are opponents of them. And so they couldn't share the same country. They are so much polarized, so to say. And Antakya is the city where I live, for example. It is a southern city of Turkey, and it is a border city with Syria, have a long borderline with Syria. And in this city, Antakya, people started using the same discourse, and they left their country and stigmatizing their own country. And also they were stigmatized in Antakya here in Turkey. They also said that you fled away, you escaped your country, you are traitors and you are not loyal to your country. So what about polarization in Venezuela? Do you also have such a polarization in between different groups of Venezuelan community inside the country? And also there is a mass outflux to Colombia. And what is the attitude and perspective of Colombians towards those refugees or migrants, or there any stigmatization against Venezuelans living there? And maybe you can start now your cameras during QA session so that we feel as if we were physically together.
Thank you, Abir, for your question. Polarization is part of our upbringing, especially, well, not mine because I was born before the 2000s, you can bet, but the generations that were born from the 90s onward don't remember another, not polarized context. And it was polarization in Venezuela is it's almost a condition to think about Venezuela is to think about polarization. And it's perhaps one of the difficulties about doing research about there and one of the difficulties of being from there and wanting to do research about that place. Polarization, I would say, began, oh my goodness. It's maybe I cannot say really when it began, but I can tell that it's been part of the political strategy of Chavez before Maduro, and also part of the strategy of the extreme opposition as well, the less democratic opposition in Venezuela. So there's been a clear narrative of being either with or without that has been shaping the political scene. And Chavez had a famous speech, I think in 2007, when he was using an indigenous language, which he didn't really speak, but knew a few phrases of, trying kind of playing with this nativist logic of speaking indigenous languages, which is a hypocrisy, thinking of the situation of indigenous people in Venezuela and how we have a long history of colonial thinking. And the phrase he used is, my goodness, I should remember the words, but it translated into, you're either us or you aren't. So that logic of belonging applies to citizenship, of who is a Venezuelan, but it's permeated by being a Venezuelan became being also part of particular political project. And if you had doubts, you were a suspect. And if you opposed, you were, in fact, people are using as an insult the word stateless in Spanish, apátrida, as a way of calling you a traitor. So that narrative is clearly part of the political scene. And it's been one of the reasons, I think, why the the political stalemate only worsens because there is really little room for dialogue. There have been actually, I think, 4 attempts at creating dialogue between the government and the opposition, and in every case, the government has left the negotiations. In a similar way, the opposition has a long history of leaving the electoral processes. Most recently, the elections we had in 2020, in December this year. Sometimes time in Venezuela goes so fast that what happened in December 2020 feels like was much longer ago. But in the recent elections, most of the opposition left the race, among other reasons, because most leaders from the opposition parties were either in exile or persecuted or in jail. So I guess they had some reasons also to not be part of the electoral process. But that leaves really small space for democratic alternatives, which is what I think the majority prefers. As of polarization among migrants and people abroad, I think actually they're less polarized than they are made to be by the media. People just want to live their lives and survive and eat and have jobs. Is very non-heroic what people want, and that doesn't, play along with the polarization narrative. But they're used by the different extremes of the political elites in the region in ways that serve their narratives.
Thank you, Masaya. Are there any other questions that wants to ask? And yes, and also ben de pardon şunu şey yaptım. Deniz gibi açabilenlerinizden kameralarınızı açmanızı isteyeyim.
Please start your video if you can, so that we can see each other. Maybe some of them are lack of stable internet connection and they couldn't start the video, but the rest has better open it. And I think Mrs. Tulay, and later than that, Mr. Kemal will have questions.
Hi, Masaya. Hi, Feyzo Hocam. Thank you very much, Masaya. It's great to listen to you. Actually, I wonder, there are some people, some Armenian people living in this part of country in Antakya. Actually, they are Syrians, but some of them went to Venezuela, and I know that I realized that there is an Armenian diaspora in Venezuela. I'm sure you're aware of that. Can you please give us some information about those Armenian diaspora in Venezuela? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tulay, for your question. I'm afraid I'm not very aware of the situation of the Armenian Venezuelan diaspora in Venezuela. What I can say is that the Syrian diaspora is also quite is part of our landscape. Venezuela is probably one of the most multicultural countries in South America, with Syrian and Lebanese, Armenian, I'm thinking of another major communities, but certainly they're part of society, but not so publicly. So it's not part of the public discourse, for example, to speak about these particular communities generally. So I'm sorry, I don't know much about them.
Thank you, Masaya. And Vural'ın bir sorusu vardı. But before Vural's question, Masaya, maybe I should also have a little parenthesis here, is that the current Turkish government is also very friendly with the Maduro government. The Turkish president, Tayyip Erdogan and Maduro gets along very well and claim to be the protector of the oppressed people around the world. And I think I may be wrong on that, but someone may correct me. Now, the Turkey actually is housing the Venezuelan gold because the Maduro is worried about confiscation of Venezuelan gold in the West. So that's why that gold was brought to Turkey, and it's under Turkish protection right now. So there is that kind of, and in recently there are even other connections that between Venezuela and Turkey now being revealed and drug related. So there are all sorts of networks that exist. Is probably the type of networks that we would not necessarily like that they're there. So Vural'ın bir sorusu vardı. Vural.
Should I can comment to that.
Okay, sure.
I think I should have thought about this. I was so worried about, giving a proper thorough idea of the crisis. But this is an obvious starting point. Maduro speaks of Erdogan very frequently as a hero of the people. The Venezuelan gold is, in fact, in Turkey, and I think it's interesting and quite dramatic because of the current geopolitical context. Venezuelan assets are confiscated in many places, which adds to the already ongoing crisis, which is not a result of those confiscations, I don't think, but it's made worse by the confiscations. So a lot of alliances are booming, and the alliance with Turkey precedes the sanctions. Actually, one of the worst images of Maduro in the recent years is Maduro having one of the most expensive forms of meat one can have in a Turkish restaurant by a Turkish chef. And it was a scandal because Venezuela was in 2017 when people were literally hungry. And there he was, having spectacular meal, yes. Which I'm sure food in Turkey is amazing, but it was a slap in the face for most people to see him doing that. So yes, there is that friendship. In fact, one of the reasons Venezuela hasn't been so affected by COVID, among others, is that there are so very few flights coming into the country already before the pandemic. And one of the few flights that we have goes through Istanbul. So there you go.
Vural.
Tekrar sunum için teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you very much for the presentation once again. Indeed, each of our sessions lead us to new concepts for defining refugees and migrants. Personally, I could say that. You also mentioned that topic of idlers, walkers in Spanish language. So there is indeed a well-established ground for defining migrants. So what about those walkers, idlers?
Kalıyorlar yoksa
do they stay in surrounding countries of Venezuela, or do they have a final destination in mind and they keep moving forward? And for example, in Ecuador, I personally saw them there. There are some Afghan people, other people, Venezuelan people who targeted to go to US or even northern countries. So do they have a specific target as walkers, or their target or destination is limited with surrounding countries of Venezuela only? Thank you for your answer in advance.
Thank you, Vidal, for your question. I think, well, there are, I am of the opinion that there are many problems with how we defined refugees and migrants even before the situation of Venezuelans, among others, because of how much the world has changed since the convention came to be, and also how specific the convention was in terms of the particular context in which it was created. I think one of the things that the situation of Venezuelans brings to the conversation globally is this, and I say it a little bit with humor, this way the UNHCR kind of categorizes people now. So there are refugees, there are displaced populations, and there are Venezuelans. We are counted with them, but not quite. You know, it's they don't know what to do with us. And they're only really thinking about what to do with us because we are about 6 million people. So you either do something or it will be a crisis even larger, which is, I think, the inability to come up with inclusive categories is only making the crisis worse, not only in Venezuela, certainly for Venezuelans, and in South America and the Caribbean also. I didn't mention it, but Venezuelans are also living by sea, and the Caribbean is now becoming also a deadly sea with capsized boats of very impoverished Venezuelans living by boat to Trinidad and Tobago, Curacao, which in particular Curacao and Aruba, as Dutch islands, have had a very poor treatment of Venezuelans coming in. About the caminantes and the dwellers, I think one thing they have done is to make the situation very clear. You know, the existence of the crisis and their own presence has been, I think, has shaped a lot of the discussion in South America. One of the perhaps more dramatic aspects of their trajectories, especially at the beginning, is that perhaps due to the very little experience we had culturally of emigrating, people left without any clue of where they were going. It was just this idea of living because of living. There are these interviews of walkers done by journalists that moved with them and asking where they were going, and they were often unclear, or they had this idea of going to the US but walking down to Colombia without really a plan of how to make it from Colombia to the US. This idea of the US as, you know, this idyllic modern destination, which, well, we know it's not the case. Very recently, a group of Venezuelans reached the US through El Rio Grande, through crossing by foot. And again, this became kind of a spectacular depiction by the media, and this, you know, were kind of used in a way to spectacularize the crisis in Venezuela in favor also of the idea of the US. It's quite terrible to see, for example, how this arrival was dealt with compared as often the arrivals of Central Americans or Haitians to similar regions. So there is an aspect of using the Venezuelans in a way that serve certain narratives as well. But I don't think people have a very specific, clear journey set up. I think a lot of people stay in the borderlands with Colombia, especially those who live with very basic, resources. Colombia is an attractive destination in terms of distance from home, if you fantasize with the idea of returning when things get better. And also culturally, there is a certain proximity there. But this idea of the dweller and the walker, rather than a category compared to the refugee or any particular migration category, I think tells us about the act of mobility and moving as a political decision wherever it takes you, which is what's most powerful in their case, I think.
Thank you, Masaya. Başka sorusu olan var mıydı?
Anyone who would like to address any further questions?
I can ask, because the beginning of your presentation
Masaya,
must gender dimension of this situation and particularly the journeys and within these movements. And last week, Carla talked about the gender dynamics taking place at the US-Mexico border. So when we look at the gender dimension of the Venezuelan crisis, how does it manifest itself in this particular case? I mean, it's a very, of course, large topic, but are there any particular sort of entry points that comes to your mind that you can tell us?
Yes. I would think of two very clear ones for me that I think are important to speak about. One of them is from Venezuela itself. One of the symptoms or one of the characteristics of the crisis is the deterioration of the conditions of living, as I mentioned. But that has reflected reflects into a very, very dramatic increase of maternal mortality and newborn mortality. Between 2016 and 2017, maternal mortality increased by 65% in Venezuela, which is tragic. And that's a part of the crisis that nobody has really paid attention to. Child mortality, I'm trying to remember the proper word, but early child mortality increased by 35% during the same period. So there is an aspect to the crisis that is very much embodied by women, that is related also to the mobilities of women. And this is particularly important among transborder communities and pendular mobilities. So according to the director of the main hospital in Cucuta, which is the largest city in the Colombian side of the border, 80% of births in their hospital are Venezuelan women giving birth. So the vast majority of births are women who are crossing to get healthcare and to deliver their babies on the other side of the border. Add to that people are crossing the border to give birth while borders are closed, and they have to do it informally, dealing with guerrillas and paramilitary groups, etc. So giving birth is a challenge in Venezuela, to the point that people, you know, are deciding to cross the borders under those circumstances and consider that a viable option as compared to giving birth in Venezuela. So that's an aspect that is clearly gendered. And there are other forms in which gender is affecting the way people move and the experiences of people on the move. In the case of men crossing the border, and especially again in the borderlands, the amount of violence that men are exposed to when they're crossing is shaped by the armed conflict. And it's the same for women in terms of the effects of the armed conflict, but this plays out differently for men and women. And in a context in which these borderlands are already quite impoverished places, and most people in the area, we can assume, are irregularized. They don't have migration status. They don't have access to the labor market in safe ways. And in a context of protracted conflict, joining an armed group is one of the most obvious options for youth, especially male youth. And sometimes it's not really an option. In certain areas, you have to become part of one of the armed groups if you want to survive in that community. So a lot of men and a lot of young men become involved in the armed conflict, which is, I think, an area of concern, a way more serious concern than it is being considered at the moment because of the rate of violence that we're seeing in the borderlands right now. And the armed conflict is also affecting women in other ways. They're also having to deal with the logic of the irregular armed groups, which also, there are many different armed groups. So it's really difficult for people to figure out what the rules are, because in certain groups in certain areas is the National Army of Liberation, which is a guerrilla group. In others, there is another guerrilla group that comes from FARC. In others, there are different gangs that stem from paramilitary groups. So each group has their own rules, and it's really hard for people to figure them out. One thing that is clear is that they have different approaches to sex work. For example, some of them have specific rules about who can and when and where can sex work be done, considering that sex work is one of the very few job alternatives or work alternatives, income sources for women in the borderlands. And also it's often imposed and it becomes sort of the obligation for women, as it is for men to join these forces. So it's a very, especially in the borderlands, I find it is a very difficult and gendered process that people have to deal with. And the sexualization of Venezuelan women in the region is blatant. I mean, it's obvious in the newspapers. Women in the Colombian local newspapers at the beginning of the migration crisis spoke about, headlines referred to women, Venezuelan women, as marriage broke. I don't know, how would you say?
Violating the marriage relation?
Yes, women who, destroyed marriages. And there's this whole sexualization of Venezuelan women around this that doesn't help their integration.
Thank you, Masaya. 11.30 civarı bitirmeye çalışıyoruz. Bazen biraz geçiyor.
We try to end our session usually at 6:30, but now we already run out of time. And if you don't have any questions, I would like to thank Masaya once again for your time, for your distinguished information, valuable information, for that presentation. Short presentation makes much sense for us. And as you said previously, she was my student once. Of course, I didn't say it because I don't want you to learn my age. But now you can guess how old I am. She was one of my students during first years of my academic career, and I always remember her with good feelings. She was one of my best students ever, and it is a great pleasure for me to organize such sessions in cooperation with her. Seeing her here is a great pleasure for me. Thank you very much, Masaya, for joining us. And I saw that Mrs. Tulay raised her hand.
We all know that you have just started when you are 13. So the age gap is just 13, don't worry. And secondly, when I listened to Masaya, I just felt that I think the Venezuela and the Colombia is in like Middle East, because the problems are the same, you know, especially the last bit, because Turkish women once blamed Russian immigrant women, and now they're blaming the Syrian immigrant women, and the stories are never changing. Thank you, Masaya. Keep in touch. Thank you very much for your great presentation. Thank you, Feyzo Hocam.
Evet, ben de tekrar teşekkür ediyorum hepinize. Masaya da
Thank
çok
you once again, and specific thanks to Masaya. And Thursday, you will listen to Kim's presentation, and see you then. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.